Advocacy Center here at Loyola Law School. We're so thrilled that all of the candidates for House District 91 can be here tonight, especially Mr. Leger, who is unfortunately unable to serve anymore, but I'm sure he will have some great questions for the candidates, and I look forward to an enjoyable evening. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you all for joining us tonight, and I'd like to start off by just thanking Loyola Law School for hosting this this forum. Starting on my far left, Pepper Roussel, Robert McKnight, Mandy Landry, and Carling Dinkler. We thank them all for offering themselves for public service and for expressing their opinions in forum after forum, and I hope that these questions will give you an opportunity to continue to introduce yourselves to the community and to voters, and really articulate for us how you intend to serve the people of District 91. And again, I want to commend you all for offering yourselves for service. There will be a series of questions. We will attempt to change the order in which they're answered so that people can all have an opportunity to be the first and also be the last to answer questions. You'll have 2 minutes to respond to each. We're going to jump right into the questions, and if we have time at the end, we're going to allow some time for a brief summary and wrap up. We're very fortunate to have the Loyola Law School Advocacy Center, which Dean Landrew and other leaders at the law school have enacted because they recognize the responsibility that this law school has to not only study the issues, but also advocate for those policies that they think will benefit the people of our city and our region and our state. And we're thankful to have them volunteering to support this tonight. Our timekeeper will be over here, and she will indicate to me when time is up. And I'll do my best not to be rude when I interrupt you, but I'm going to kind of try to keep us on schedule. So, Ms. Roussel, we're going to start the first question with you. Over the last 10 years, this state has had its ups and downs as it relates to the budget and to the structure of our revenue system. Many have suggested that structural tax reform measures are necessary in order to create a more stable fiscal environment. What specifically would you support in order to create that more stable fiscal environment?
Thank you, Representative Leger. I appreciate the question. So the budget that I've been sort of poring over intermittently the past couple of days or so has a lot of money in it in a couple of different pockets. Some of those pockets we don't necessarily need, or, well, I say we don't need, because things like private prisons should not be funded. So if we were looking at the $650 million or so that we have going into private prisons, we could fund quite a bit. However, if we were looking more broadly at, say, systemic changes to the budget, the operating budget, as well as the total recommended state general fund, what we might consider, is to revisit the line items that are going to not only higher education, K through 12, but also to other entities such as the Board of Regents, and possibly entertain the idea of a constitutional convention. The Constitutional Convention, which has been flirted with for a number of years, has fallen short in the past few cycles of actually getting enough votes in order to call. However, if we are to rewrite how it is that we do address those items that are baked into our Constitution, the only way to do that is to rewrite it. Not in part, but in total.
Thank you. Mr. McKnight, what structural tax reform measures would you support in order to create a more stable fiscal environment?
Sure, that's a great question. So from the outset, I definitely would support a constitutional convention. We must take a look at Article 7, which deals with taxes and revenue. At this time, the Louisiana Constitution has over 74,000 words. That is shameful. We have a regressive tax system in which we tax the least of these in our society. Secondly, we have to have a fair and a simple way that we collect taxes and handle revenue. Right at this time, we have a decentralized station in which we collect sales tax. So we must find a way to centralize that autonomy and also focus on the budget, which is very important. So those are a few ways that I think that we can attack revenues as well as the fiscal budget at this time.
Ms. Landry, what structural tax reform measures would you support in order to create a more stable fiscal environment?
Who has started to reform, and that with new progressive legislators we could really reform that system and get some of that money for our localities. And I think I'm the only candidate in this race who absolutely is not in support. Extreme Republicans in charge of the legislature, I can only be afraid of what might happen there. I think all of the amendments, although there are many, and as a longtime lawyer, believe me, our civil code is very long. All those amendments were voted on by people, and if people don't want them, we can remove them. But to kind of hand the keys over while there is almost a supermajority in the legislature, I think would be a very bad idea. And for that matter, the governor and I think Abraham are both not in favor of that. So, thanks.
Thank you. Mr. Dinkler, what structural tax reforms would you support in order to create a more stable fiscal environment?
Yeah, I think first we need to realize that our tax system, it doesn't work for anybody. So it doesn't work for working class people. We have a regressive sales tax that is, depending on where you are in a parish, may have a different rate. And so we do have to centralize sales tax collection. I also believe that we need to bring the sales tax rate down, because if we don't, then we're just putting that burden more on working class individuals who that tax hits harder. And we have to look at the fact that I think 16% of the revenue we take in from the state comes from the state.
I just want a yes or no answer to this question. Several of you have referenced dedicated funding for specific purposes. Would you support undedicated funding for the following? So this is just going to be a yes or no. I'm going to start with you, Mr. Dinkler. Would you support undedicated funding for K through 12 education?
No.
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 Support undedicated funding for coastal restoration?
No.
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 Would you support undedicated funding for healthcare, Mr. Dinkler?
No.
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 Oh, no, I'm sorry, I was waiting on my turn.
Would you support undedicated funding for transportation infrastructure?
No.
District 91, and what would you do to support that industry?
That's a great question, Representative Leger. So the Port of New Orleans is in District 91, and I've met with the port, and I can tell you it's my appreciation that the biggest economic driver in District 91 are those jobs that prop up industries that are on the Port of New Orleans. I can tell you now, I'm a public defender here in New Orleans. To answer your latter question, Representative, we have to find ways to go and affect two things. One, schools, as well as technical schools. Additionally, we must address those individuals that re-enter society who are looking for employment, because I do believe economic development is not only a one fix, it's a holistic approach. So we got to focus on jobs, those re-entering, reducing the jail population. And those are two ways that I have worked on in the city of New Orleans as a public defender. So number one, we got to focus on getting these people these jobs who are re-entering society. And two, we must get those folks from school to industry, not school to prison. In the Port of New Orleans, they have those jobs.
Thank you, Ms. Landry.
We need to keep what we're doing with healthcare, keep the Medicaid expansion protected, keep expanding childcare so that parents can go to work and that they can go to school. We need to, number one, raise the minimum wage in the state. $7.25, what people have been getting, is not enough to live on in any parish, least of all Orleans Parish. I know that there are those who come before me who talk about our human infrastructure, and I think that is super important. We are nothing in this state if we don't have people who are healthy and able to work and able to go to school and able to invent things. So that would be my answer to that.
There's much more that we can do to support our small businesses and our job creators, particularly small businesses owned by women and minorities. And so in my day-to-day work, I work on programs that provide access to capital for those businesses that are underserved by traditional resources like banks or venture capital, private equity. So I'd love to see us look for ways from a policy perspective to drive more private resources into supporting the small businesses that really.
You identify as most important economic driver in the state of Louisiana that impacts District 91. What would you do to support it?
Well, I would not necessarily support it, but the most important economic driver in District 91 and most of Louisiana is poverty. We have a cash bail system. We are suffering with large incarceration rates, juvenile detention. We fine folks for not having insurance, and then the fines and the fees continue to mount and add up. I was talking with a teacher a couple of nights ago who was saying that she's afraid to drive her car anywhere but to school, which is her job, or to the grocery store, because at this point she cannot afford to get rid of all of the fines and the fees that she's being taxed with. So we also have, as a result of our widespread poverty, is income-driven crimes. So whether they are crimes against nature, prostitution, for those of you who are not in the legal field, or we're looking at drugs. Most folks are not doing these things or selling these things because they want to. They're doing it in order to survive. So whether it is that you look at it as a matter of folks not only create new jobs in the district, but that we also create an environment that is sustainable and supportable for generations to come. It's not just about today and what money you can make in the next 2 years. It's about ensuring that our children and their children's children can find not only New Orleans, but also Louisiana as a place that they want to continue to live, that they build community, and they actually expand our culture.
Thank you. This next question is sort of a follow-up. We're gonna do 1-minute responses because we're gonna try to move through it quickly. It's sort of related. You all know that in Orleans Parish, there are a number of political subdivisions that are created under state law. Can you please identify what political subdivision of the state of Louisiana, located in Orleans Parish and impacting District 91, is the most important to our continued economic success? We'll start with Ms. Leger.
Sewage and Water Board? I think for sure. I mean, we don't exist without it. It's under water. Sorry for the joke there. Look, y'all. I mean, thank you. If New Orleans doesn't have clean drinking water, and if our cars flood every few months, and if we're constantly worried about flooding in the city, we're not going to be able to have people coming in town. We're not going to have the tourism industry. They're just not going to come. And where are we going to live? Meanwhile. I think we need to make sure that that's protected, and it is complicated how it's a state-controlled entity, but there's, like my neighbor, for instance, sits on the board of it as the citizen outreach representative. I think that's something that we need to make sure is funded, not just for improvements, but for maintenance, as we've seen all the cars being pulled out. There's a lot that has to be done there.
Thank you. Mr. Dickler.
Yeah, I would say it's Sewage and Water Board, absolutely. I mean, it is the issue. If you go through the district and you can go from a Fontainebleau neighborhood to Gertown to the Garden District to Holly Grove, people will tell you that they're concerned about their streets and they're concerned about water. And so we absolutely have to make, I mean, we have not invested in the infrastructure of the city. And when I say that, the drainage capacity for the Sewage and Water Board.
Ms. Rousseau.
The most important political subject, I actually really want to have a different answer, but I don't. So you have an infrastructure that is old, and it's not just old yesterday, and it's not a recent administration that hasn't paid enough attention to it. We collectively over time haven't done enough in order to ensure that not only are the drains working, but that our pipes are being replaced. And so as we look at some of the things that we should be or could be doing, I also will say that as we also talk about things like rising insurance rates for cars that get flooded out, for houses that are being damaged every time we have a heavy rain. Yes, we do need to.
The drainage system and the infrastructure, it's not only a quality of life issue, but we're also affecting employees. I like to say a pot of red beans has never cooked itself and a horn has never played itself. So you're looking at a mother and or a father who may have to miss work because there's not clean drinking water. So we must address this issue from a holistic approach.
Thank you. This question is somewhat, Louisiana has among the lowest property taxes in the nation, partially because of a state tax exemption related to the homestead exemption. In other local governments across the country, local governments fund important initiatives like community and technical colleges, community-based health clinics, as well as major infrastructure projects. Would you support cutting taxes at the state level and increasing property taxes at the local level so that local governments can have more autonomy over their fiscal affairs?
Well, I certainly think that local governments should have more autonomy to set their affairs in their community. New Ridge and New Orleans have very different things that they need to concentrate on, and so I absolutely do believe that we need to give locals more control. And I certainly, if there was a trade-off where you could lower state taxes and still the cities could find ways to get the resources that they need without pricing people out of their homes, I would be looking at a proposal like that. That if in the net we were sure that, especially for working class people, it wasn't going to be an overwhelming burden. But look, I think it does go back. I know we've had discussions about constitutional convention, and I do think there are ways to do limited constitutional convention where we look at some of the fiscal issues that are in the Constitution that should probably be more addressed in statute. And I think it does speak to the way our state is set up, where there's too much that has to go through Baton Rouge that really affects local government. It should be in the hands of locals.
Mr. Sept.
2 minutes, right?
Yes.
So I think that we're creating a false equivalent, right? So I believe that we can have more autonomy over our fiscal affairs locally without raising homes prices, without ensuring that our elderly, our folks who are coming into New Orleans who want to stay here are simply being priced or pushed out of their own neighborhoods. The idea of being able to purchase a home and pay that rate of taxes until you sell that house is not crazy. There are other states that do it, and we could too. That way we could ensure that if you purchase a house, you don't have to worry every couple of years about not being able to pay that tax bill. Especially as we look at neighborhoods like Hollygrove and Gertown and even Central City, where there's a possibility that we'll be transitioning in those neighborhoods. We've already seen it in Lower Garden District and Irish Channel, where there are very few of the folks who used to live there, the folks who are from there, are left and remain there. I don't think that we need to trade, or we should be trading, what makes sense in order to appease an idea that we created some time ago. By moving forward with something like a flat tax or a flat rate, easy to do if we just look at the homestead exemption that's currently in existence and modify the language of it. States like Florida and California do it now. If we needed something that was a little bit more robust and we didn't want to do it ourselves, we could look to them. So, do I think that we need more autonomy over our fiscal affairs? Yes. Do I think that we need to raise property taxes in order to do it? No.
Thank you, Mr. McKnight.
Yeah, so the second issue as it relates to issues that I hear when I go door to door, church to church, community to community is definitely this particular issue here, the fabric of to communities with those individuals who are on a fixed income, those who are seniors, those who are coming back into society without the means to pay their property taxes. So again, we must not allow our culture to be shaken at its core. However, I do agree with local control, local autonomy. I definitely support the senator in Baton Rouge, as well as Madam Mayor, as it relates to allowing local governments to control and have autonomy over what is best for New Orleans. And as I mentioned earlier, I do support the Constitutional Convention. And as it was mentioned, we can have a goal, but in exchange, I don't know I would go that far.
Thank you, Ms. Landon.
Yeah. I mean, I would echo the local control on wages and taxes for sure. We definitely need to restructure how property taxes are allocated in the city, but I certainly don't think there would be anyone who would be in favor of raising them. Part of the issue with the structure that has also been getting a lot of attention lately is that there are many, many entities, I think as much as a third of the entities who pay property taxes, or a third of the property, excuse me, that's taxed, that are considered nonprofits. And at first glance, that sounds nice, like a church should not pay property taxes, but the problem I've seen in my own neighborhood is often there's a nonprofit that owns several properties around, and sometimes they get rent on them, and sometimes they knock them down and use them for parking. I mean, shaking your head, you know exactly what I'm talking about. That's not fair. Like, if you get rent on a property, you should pay taxes on that property. So I definitely think we need to look at what's going on locally. And again, I really think ITAP is going to be something that's going to get a lot of attention in the next few years. That has to do with our property taxes locally, and it's so much money. So I think those are two things, the tax exemptions on nonprofits and also ITAP, that we can restructure, but I don't think anyone in this room is even able at this moment to pay any more property taxes.
Thank you. How much more time do we have?
This is 7:15.
Oh, great. Okay. I want to thank you guys for your answers so far. They've been inspiring, and I appreciate your thoughtfulness about them. This next question, in dollars.
Oh, not numbers.
If you had the opportunity to choose between doubling the earned income tax credit or investing $50 million in the local infrastructure in the city of New Orleans, what would you choose and why?
Part of me wants to be flippant and say, oh, what all goes into the earned income tax credit. However, What does strike me is that the earned income tax credit is something that the parents use in order to get a rebate at the end of the year on tuition and books and other things of that nature. I think that the $50 million that would go into the pockets of folks who are living in District 91 that would reasonably create microeconomies inside of their neighborhoods would certainly be something that would be very well welcome to those folks who live there. Now, I personally would want to see that we invest the money in the infrastructure, but I don't think $50 million is enough to do it. And then as we look at how it is that we would go about the prospect of actually getting those pipes pulled up, those streets repaved, what does that look like operationalized? So I'm gonna choose the earned income credit.
Thank you, Mr. McKnight. There is no wrong answer here. Thank you for your
See, that was not on.
And my interests lie with my district, and I can tell you now, if I'm fortunate to go to Baton Rouge, I mean, the streets and the drainage, I definitely want to focus on the infrastructure to ensure that folks have an opportunity to enhance their quality of life. I mean, the streets, the roads, I mean, it's all about public safety, right? If folks can't get to work, folks can't get home, then we're looking at a situation in which quality of life is affected. So if I had to choose between the two, it would definitely be the latter to ensure that District 91 is in a position in which we are at our best, and that relates to infrastructure, transportation, and public safety.
Thank you, Ms. Langer.
The state highest rates of children in poverty, of women in poverty, of people of color in poverty. I mean, the list goes on. That leads to worse health outcomes, higher unplanned pregnancies, lower education levels. I mean, all of that is related. I don't come from a family with business owners. My father was a plumber, and I know what it's like. I remember, I was remembering this the other night in our other forum that my dad lost his job in the 80s for a while when the oil industry tanked. And I remember that, and I remember my mom going back to work for health insurance, which is something we are still all worried about today. I think there's no question when you have to choose between people or projects that we should choose people. I think the projects, we will have to figure it out other ways and fund themselves. But if you put money in the hands of people who need it, whether it's through raising the minimum wage or this tax credit, I think as a state we will see the biggest benefit.
Thank you. Mr. Dingler.
I'd like to do both. Nothing you can do with that $50 million would be the earned income tax credit.
Thank you. This next question, we're going to start with Mr. McKnight. The state has a $16 billion backlog in deferred maintenance for highways, roads, and bridges. This is not to mention much needed capacity projects that are regional in nature and that help to grow the economy, as well as transportation projects. Sufficient revenue in order to even provide for the receipt of a full federal match of the dollars that are available for our transportation projects. What efforts would you support in order to provide that sufficient match? And if you could choose a regional transportation project that you believe would have the most impact on our region, what would it be?
Sure. So two ways I would answer that question. Number one, we have to look at raising the gas tax. So I would start by looking at raising the gas tax. And secondly, we have to look at private public partnerships, right? We have to find ways to stimulate the development in this state. And I think looking at private public partnerships in which we look at the private sector to pay and fund various infrastructure projects. And over time, the public sector, whether it be tolls or fees, will pay the private sector back. So those are two ways I think that we can address infrastructure. One, raising local gas tax, and two, looking at private public infrastructure in development.
Thank you, Ms. Langer.
Lines are kind of in reverse. Like I mentioned earlier, we had this environmental forum the other night. It was actually great to talk about a lot of these issues. I mean, I think our number one infrastructure issue as a state is coastal restoration and flooding. There are innumerable projects. There's so much money needed for it. That goes to the bridges, to roads, but also making sure we don't flood, making sure we have the sediment where we need it. There's so much money involved there. And so we talked about the other night, where is that going to come from? Because clearly we don't have it in the state. There's people in prison for a nonviolent offense. And number two, if we move to the step of legalizing it, that's a lot of money. I mean, there's a lot of people in Colorado who are wealthy now because of it. And obviously, if we do that, we have to make sure it's done right, that that money is going back into the communities that it has been stripped from because members of their community have gone to prison for so long. But I think that there's money available if we're willing to take a few risks and maybe do a few things differently than we've done for a long time. And we need to make sure that we're protected from hurricanes and flooding. I mean, the city's sinking, and that should be our #1 priority.
Thank you. Mr. Dickens.
Yeah, so I do agree, we need to raise the gas tax, it's been too long, and we are putting our federal funds in jeopardy. I mean, it sort of reminds me of where we were before we did Medicaid expansion, where we were literally leaving federal money on the table because Governor Jindal decided that politically he didn't want to expand Medicaid. And so we're doing that here, and I think we're trying to save money, but we're actually losing it in the long run. As far as what is the project that I would want to invest in, I agree, coastal restoration is incredibly important.
The question is, obviously the state has a severe backlog as it relates to maintenance, upgrades, et cetera, not to mention funding capacity projects. What would you support in order to generate revenue that would help us provide the dollars necessary to draw down our federal match? And also, what regional infrastructure project would you identify as a key?
Gotcha. Okay, so thank you, I appreciate that. Sure. The things that I would support would be reviewing the fund that is given to the convention center with the amount of money that's going, that we're all in support of Mayor Cantrell's fair share. And there are hard numbers that can be used in order to improve a lot of roads and the infrastructure right in town. I would also look at taxing some of the larger tax credits, the larger nonprofits. Think Tulane, it is a nonprofit and does not pay taxes in order to offset some of the funding needs. Additionally, ITAP. So Mandy brought it up earlier, the industrial tax credit, or industrial tax exemption program is leaving millions upon millions of dollars every year on the table. Meanwhile, it's degrading a lot of our communities with not only soil, but also water and air contamination. So those are the 3 things that I would look to. And what I would really love to see would be an improved and more robust public transportation system. If we can get some of the cars off of the road by ensuring that we have more buses, that we have trains. There was talk not long after Katrina about putting on a light rail of sorts that would go from here to Baton Rouge. How great would that be? Additionally, if we would just be able to standardize going from here into Jefferson, would be a godsend for a lot of people who just work on the other side of the parish line. So there are a lot of little things that we can do. And I think that it's incumbent upon all of us to look at not just what we have done before, but the things that we might be able to do and back our way into the future that we want to see.
Thank you. All excellent answers. Might I also commend to you all to consider funding a project at the Port of New Orleans that would get 18-wheelers off of Chapatoulas onto the interstate faster and onto the business that they need to do. That would be a very essential investment for our region. And I appreciate all that you said. I just want to take my editorial to leave that on the table for you.
No, I've got a question for you. I talked with the Port of Baton Rouge about how they are expanding their rail service and the funding that's going to be going into taking a lot of those 18-wheelers off of the ground, right? And utilizing trains and their boxcars to move agriculture from central Louisiana. It makes sense to me that with its expanded rail service that we could bring it all the way here into New Orleans. But that's, the question was,
but I'm not taking
are we
questions.
thinking about that?
So
unfair.
I don't have to answer questions. So I'm going to wrap it up. This is going to be the final question. Again, actually, I think I'm just going to let you close. I had another question. I'm going to go ahead and give you a few moments to close. You guys have been absolutely sensational and thoughtful about your responses. Can we please give them a round of applause? Ms. Landry, I'm going to let you begin with a 2-minute closing for each.
And there's a few of you. I was in your position, it was 17 years ago now that I started law school, and I was thinking about my life before law school and after, and it kind of tells you a little bit about me. Like I said, I grew up in Marrero. My dad was a plumber, my mom was a school secretary, and I ended up going to Georgetown Law School 24 years later. And that was a long road I traveled, and I was about to say, for many of you, there's not a lot of students in here, but for first generation students, to travel that far from home and to go to a school so expensive, it was get it from working around asbestos. And so I wasn't planning to move home, but home I did a few months later, and I've been here 9 years ever since. A few years after my dad passed away, my mom gently pushed me out of the nest again, and I was kind of looking for where to live, and I ended up in this lovely little neighborhood, Uptown, 5 years ago, right around Peniston and Ferret Street, and it's become my new home. I, like many of you know, in New Orleans, it's hard to buy a house, and I ended up buying a double. It helps me pay the mortgage, and I'm on my neighborhood. And that's kind of where my life has been. My life has also turned a little bit as a lawyer. I started out just doing civil work, commercial work for businesses, and then I moved home. And the state of women in this state is so distressing, and every year the abortion bills become worse and worse and worse. And about 4 years ago, I changed my practice, and I moved to a firm that's one of, at least, I think only 2 in the state, who actually represented one of the last 3 abortion clinics in the state, and it's something that's very important to me, that I'm glad I work with people who do that kind of work under the seat. Oh, I'm sorry. Anyway, I answered the call. That's why I'm here, basically. I felt that someone had to do it, so thank you all for coming tonight.
Thank you. Thank you. Mr.
Well, first, thank you to Loyola for hosting this event. I think this is great. This has been a great experience to be able to have questions posed by someone who has been there, and thank you for being here this evening. Grew up in New Orleans. Actually grew up in the Marigny, before the Marigny was cool, and it was the community that growing up in that community taught me what I love about New Orleans. It was a diverse neighborhood that had so much culture and heart and soul, and when I left, I didn't know if I would come back, and it called to me, and I missed it. And I knew that it would be important for me to come home and raise my family here. It would be important culturally for me, for my daughter to be a New Orleanian. I worry about where our community is headed in terms of economic development, to have careers here. And if we don't invest now in our city and our state and make some fundamental changes, I don't know that there's going to be the opportunity here that's going to keep them. And so, I'm sure my fellow candidates get tired of my analogy, but I think of New Orleans in this way. I think of it as an old house that has all these great architectural elements in it, and this great family lives there that's got a lot of characters in it. And the house has got to invest in the foundation of this community. We are going to have cracks in the wall no matter what color we paint them. And I believe that my experience, I've spent about 7 years up on Capitol Hill working for 2 members of Congress, reading and writing legislation, helping put policy together that impacts communities. I do it today in my normal life, in my regular job, where I work with state lawmakers across the country to create programs. And I believe I have the experience and the passion, and I want to be able to make this community a better place.
To remain in other parts of the state, but New Orleans is as close to a home as I have, and I love it more than anything or any place that I've lived before. I am New Orleans born at Charity Hospital with 80% of the population. I'm a Louisiana bred girl, and I am founding director of Culinaria Center for Food, Law, Policy, and Culture. I take all of who I am into this race, understanding that District 91 is 60 a lot to me, that they can look to the representative and know that she understands exactly what they are going through and why the platform is so important. I got into this race because I knew that redistricting and the census were coming up, and that the lines were going to be redrawn, and no one was talking about it at the time. I got into this race because I was hoping that we would be able to make some inroads around how it is that we bring money into the communities, and how we center the culture bearers.
Yes, again, I want to thank Loyola for hosting this, and Walt Leger, thank you as well, and to always the candidates. So good seeing each of you. Again, my name is Robert McKnight, and I'm running to be your next state representative for District 91. I'm a proud St. Augustine High School graduate, currently a public defender here in New Orleans. I'm a 4th generation New Orleanian, and I believe in empowering the community. As such, I co-founded my neighborhood association called Together Great Time along with my father. I proudly serve as the president for the Police Community Advisory Board for the MOP 2nd District, and I also 2 state senators. I have a proven record of service, whether it being in the legislative branch or in the community. I've also worked in Texas, and I have a proven record of passing legislation. Listen, when I get to Baton Rouge with your support, I will hit the ground running day 1 with no training was needed. I want to focus on a few issues. Issue number 1, criminal justice reform. I do believe this is a civil rights issue of this generation. Secondly, infrastructure. Third, education. And most importantly, I want to be a steady voice for women's reproductive rights in Baton Rouge. As I close, I want to share your voice. I want to be your vision. I would love to